Latin America and the Caribbean were plagued by hyperinflation during the majority of the 1980s and the early 1990s. According to IMF data, for instance, only 3 of the region's 20 countries had inflation rates above 8% in 2018, compared to 16 of them having rates above 20% in 1990. Fiscal reforms, debt talks that allowed countries to restore access to the debt markets, and more central bank autonomy were the primary contributors to that success. So how did Brazil handle inflation and get its economy fixed again? Is there anything we should learn? Curious to know? Stick around till the end. Hello and welcome back, everyone. In today's video, we will discuss how Brazil managed to control hyperinflation. For more surprising videos to watch, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications bell. Having stated that, let's get started. The case of Brazil serves as an example. Brazil's government launched several stabilization schemes in the late 1980s and early 1990s that were successful in bringing down inflation. However, as shown in recent research, until mid-1994, when Real Plan was able to permanently lower inflation, the improvements were only transitory. How did inflation change from being high to low? The Cruzado plan, the initial stabilization strategy, was founded on the idea that inflation in the past will necessarily lead to inflation in the future. Due to Brazil's historical practice of indexing wages and prices to earlier inflation rates, this is the case. At the time of the Cruzado plan, the prevailing belief among policymakers was that if agents, firms, consumers, etc., anticipated more inflation, they would increase their demand for money, which the monetary authority would then meet. As a result, there was a vicious loop where the central bank would print money, which would then cause price increases, fulfilling what the agents had initially expected. This, according to policymakers, needed to change. They believed that steps like salary and price freezes, a ban on indexation clauses, and a switch to lower denominations of currency would be sufficient to halt inflation. As a result, the Cruzado plan reduced the value of the currency by 3 zeros, while also freezing prices and wages. Indexation clauses for durations less than a year were likewise prohibited by the plan. At first, this reduced inflation, but it was insufficient. Because policymakers had ignored the true driver of inflation, high fiscal deficits, the country had returned to double-digit monthly inflation rates after 10 months. Over time, a different perspective emerged and made its way into the Real Plan. Policymakers started to realize how much the deficit crisis contributed to the inflation issue. In other words, the government was collecting financial resources, or seigniorage revenues, of on average 3.5% of GDP by printing money to pay its spending. This was a significant source of funding for the government. Therefore, the central bank would need to cut deficits or find alternative sources of funding to be able to issue less money and lower seigniorage income. The administration made a concerted attempt to decrease its deficit between June 1993 and the end of 1994 by reducing spending and raising income through higher tax rates. The primary surplus of the government increased as a result of revenues minus expenditures, not including net interest payments. Because of this, the government was able to rely less on money printing when it introduced the Real Plan in July 1994, lowering its seigniorage revenues to less than 0.5% of GDP. The restructuring of the external debt with international creditors, the Brady Plan, and the adoption of a parallel currency, or URV, that was later converted into the Real, were 2 further possible causes of the success of the plan. It is encouraging to see that, contrary to what policymakers typically worry, the fiscal reforms did not appear to significantly slow real GDP growth rates. Although it is difficult to estimate what the growth rates would have been in the absence of those measurements, the growth rates from 1993 to 1995 were noticeably higher than those from the earlier and later eras. The Real Plan did not include any price or salary controls, in contrast to earlier, less effective stabilization measures. Then what are the lessons for battling inflation? Even now, the lessons are obvious to nations in the area. Plans for stabilization should place more of an emphasis on fiscal changes than on wage and price restrictions. To slightly hedge against inflation, Brazil devised an indexation system in the 1960s that required fixing domestic pricing for some investments on a weekly or monthly basis. This provided secure and liquefiable real-term financial compensation. As the market for privately held traded financial assets expanded in the 1980s, the private sector experienced a strengthening of its balance sheets. Aggressive emergency measures weren't implemented until after the hyperinflationary period. What led to Brazil's hyperinflation? Background: the institution of money is forced to become overly flexible and unstable by hyperinflation. Money played a role in both Brazil's hyperinflation and its eventual ability to recover through the division and eventual reintegration of its two duties. Theory of inflation: Brazil saw the popularization of the new inflation hypothesis in the 1980s. This was the concept of inertial inflation, which sought to explain the various causes of inflation's acceleration and maintenance. The theory of distributive conflict, which holds that an economic agent would use the pricing mechanism to maintain or increase their market share, provides the basis for the concept of inertial inflation. According to the new hypothesis, inflation should start at a selected base period. To account for both acceleration and maintenance, analysts try to explain what caused the current level of inflation and the subsequent changes. Distributive conflict identifies a lack of cooperation between various economic agents as the fundamental cause of inflation's persistence. Largely endogenous economy: Brazil's economy is more susceptible to internal price shocks due to a lack of commerce. Prices are more unpredictable and prone to be inflated when there's a heavy reliance on domestic supply, as is the case with rising food prices brought on by weather-related shocks. Inflation in this sector is lower than the average for consumer goods due to the more free trade of durable goods. High external governmental debt: according to economist Pereira, Brazil's hyperinflation may have been caused by the public sector's asymmetrical balance sheet because excessive foreign public debt can be indirectly connected to inflationary pressures. Higher taxes were imposed by the government to pay the principal and interest on this substantial external debt. These higher taxes were then offset by higher producer prices, which helped to fuel inflation. Tax revenue was insufficient to offset the significant financial burden of servicing foreign debt. The process of the fiscal accounts deteriorating indicated a significant structural problem in the economy, which the Brazilian government tried to address on numerous occasions using various methods. Acknowledging hefty inflation: high inflation rates have always been tolerated by the Brazilian economy. An unstable financial sheet made the already high inflation worse and ultimately led to hyperinflation. Currency replacement: Brazil adopted a dependable native currency substitute that served as economic liquidity. This alternative's rapid expansion mirrored the impacts of a money shortage. High inflation, and in more severe circumstances, hyperinflation, is caused by an excessive money supply. Ineffective preventative measures: Brazil implemented several stabilization measures, many of which were based on income-based policies to control high inflation and avoid hyperinflation. As each successive cycle saw a shorter period of low inflation followed by a larger inflation peak, the cycling between stabilization and destabilization laid the groundwork for hyperinflation. Cruzado Scheme, 1986. The Cruzado Plan, which was unveiled on February 28, 1986, has 0% inflation as its goal. The policy was based on the idea that structural problems like pay indexation and systemic marked-up pricing were to blame for inflation's inertia and origin. For a year, wages were essentially frozen as the government reinstituted an indexation system. Later, bonuses were given out to alter salaries. This strategy, which was backed by monetary reform, destroyed several official indexing systems for financial assets in the Brazilian economy. According to the economist Pereira, the Cruzeiro was replaced by the Cruzado to boost domestic economic confidence and lessen inflationary pressures brought on by a depreciating currency. Up to the end of 1986, the Cruzado plan was effective. The proposal caused a severe economic catastrophe because rising wages but frozen prices sparked a demand-induced inflation wage price spiral. Since state-run businesses did not adjust their prices in advance of the price freeze to reflect anticipated future demand, the government's financial deficit widened. Brazil saw capital flight for the first time in its stabilization programs as a result of the distortion of real return on government debt. Fear of repudiation led to an increase in internal debt interest rates, which helped fuel the hyperinflationary spiral. Bresser Scheme, 1987. Instead of trying to eliminate inflation, the Bresser Plan, which went into effect on June 12, 1987, sought to enhance the economy's smooth operation by bringing inflation down to a sustainable level. The Cruzado Plan's indexation system had been legally prohibited by the three-month plan, thus it was intended to be finished as a policy reaction to the financial situation. The Bresser Plan involved price freezes as a financial shock, But this time, consumers and producers were aware of upcoming price freezes. The strategy started to fall apart in the last quarter of 1987, primarily as a result of the hefty raises handed to government employees. Summer Plan, 1989. The 4 to 8 week summer plan was implemented on January 15, 1989. It concentrated on lowering the government deficit and inflation. The first goal was to be accomplished by further price and wage controls and the adoption of a new currency, the Cruzado Novo. To close the budget deficit, the proposal called for the layoff of 90,000 public employees as well as the closure of several state-owned businesses. The latter proposition was changed in the face of vehement objection and resistance, and the deficit persisted. As a reaction to hyperinflation, there comes Collor scheme in 1990. The tripartite Collor plan, which was introduced on March 16, 1990, also imposed a price freeze. All prices were set to be frozen at their levels as of March 12, 1990, with the government later adjusting them by anticipated inflation. Through the freezing of bank accounts and the regulation of financial markets, the plan envisaged lower the amount of money in circulation. 80% of the liquidity was effectively frozen by the strategy. The economy was revived and a new currency was reintroduced using a 29% monthly increase in the money supply of the Cruzado. The government aimed to close the budget deficit and turn the operational and primary balances into surpluses. The government increased taxes, raised the cost of state-produced commodities, reduced most of the subsidiaries, fired 50,000 federal workers, and privatized public sector businesses. Through a reduction in monthly inflation from 81.3% in March 1990 to 11.3% in April 1990, this method was able to control hyperinflation. After price controls were removed in July 1990, Brazil experienced significant inflation once again. So that's all for today's video. What's your takeaway from this video? Do you think Brazil handled its inflation effectively? Drop your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you loved today's video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more similar stuff. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. We'll see you with the next one. Thanks for watching.